If you clicked on this video, then you've seen the Spider-Verse movies and you know how they look. That comic book-like art style, the hand-drawn outlines, the halftones, the hand-drawn smears, essentially the 2D and 3D mix. Although it's not actually a mix, but we'll get into that. When Into the Spider-Verse came out, it didn't just look good, it felt unlike anything we've ever seen. And we know that ever since then, other movies and shows adapt pieces of this type of animation. Some pulled it off and some definitely didn't. But the question is, why weren't we seeing this art style before Spider-Verse? And why did everyone start copying it after? I mean, surely it's not a new concept, right? So in this video, we're going to be talking about what makes Spider-Verse animation actually unique, what studios were doing before, and how Spider-Verse basically kickstarted a whole new wave of this animation trend. So you have to talk about what exactly it is. And I won't lecture you, so here's a quick version. Spider-Verse isn't mixing 2D and 3D in the way people think. It's actually fully 3D animation that's deliberately mimicking the rules, mistakes, and exaggerations of hand-drawn 2D animation. And that's what makes it stand out. And in doing that, they broke the industry's golden rule, realism. So let's talk about this standard. For 2 decades, 3D animated movies had one look, and it was driven by one goal, realism. This started because at the time, many older audiences dismissed 2D animation as just cartoons for kids, and making animated movies that looked more like real life was the way to get everyone in theaters, and it worked. 3D only animated movies were making billions where traditional 2D couldn't, proving to the studios that general audiences had a clear favorite. This created the norm. 3D animated films are usually animated on ones, meaning they use 24 frames per second. The goal is to mimic the continuous motion of a live-action camera. The movies were filled with computer-made, hyper-realistic backgrounds and objects, lifelike hair, water, super realistic mouth movements. Every studio wanted to look like Pixar and make Pixar money. But the result was that they all started looking the same, smooth, clean, and often visually bland. And honestly, you can still see this struggle today. I mean, look at Moana 2. It looks technically flawless. The water, the hair, it's all hyper-realistic and extremely well animated, but it's also painfully bland. And it's a perfect example of what happens when a studio prioritizes technical perfection over a unique style. And then there was the Spider-Verse effect. Now, Spider-Verse did a lot of things that are unique to Spider-Verse, but the entire style is built around using these 3 techniques that you see across almost every movie or show that looks like this. The first technique is the choppiness. If you look at any of the new films, you instantly notice the choppiness. That's from a change in frame rate. A normal 3D movie is running at 24 frames per second, that is animated on ones, giving you that realistic smoothness. However, these films use 12 frames per second, that is they animate on 2s, sometimes 3s, that is 8 frames per second. It's an intentional choice to make the movement feel snappier, choppier, and more cartoonish, mimicking hand-drawn 2D animation. The second thing they did was getting that hand-drawn effect, so they had to use 2D elements and apply them onto the 3D backgrounds. That's the hybrid 2D 3D feel. They have artists hand draw all the lightning, the smoke, the dust, and the smear frames. Smear frames are those distorted sketches that emphasize motion instead of a computerized motion blur. This directly over the 3D backgrounds. It brings the sketchy feeling to the final film. And the third technique is applying thick and expressive outlines around the 3D characters, and sometimes using hand-drawn facial features to make it look illustrated. The characters look like they were drawn by a comic book artist, rather than being realistic and without texture. The lines are there to emphasize motion and form, making the characters look like 3D illustrations. So those 3, the choppy motion, the hand-drawn 2D elements, and the character outlines are the major consistent techniques used to achieve this style. But that doesn't mean that all of these projects use these 3, but more on that later. Here are the things that were unique to Spider-Verse. The first detail is the print texture itself. If you look closely at the shadows or even the backgrounds, you can see tiny colored dots called halftones. And the other thing is that the movie isn't always fully animated. In moments of drama or realization, the action will freeze for a bit and become a hand-drawn picture. They're illustrated pieces that look exactly like comic panels. And they take that further by using actual panel layouts. Sometimes the screen will literally split into framed boxes to show different things happening at once, like a comic. Plus, they use on-screen words to represent sound and motion. So that brings us to the big question. If these techniques are just basic 2D principles, why did no one use them for 2 decades? Why wait for Spider-Verse to try it? The simple answer is that smoothness and realism was money. The clean, realistic 3D style was printing billions across studios for 20 years, creating absolutely no reason for any studio executive to take a risk risk on something so chaotic and stylized that they weren't even sure people wanted. Even the people behind Spider-Verse were nervous. No one wanted to mess with a formula that already guaranteed profits. Techniques like choppiness and strong outlines too closely resembled the medium that they were trying to escape. Studios didn't want their big budget 3D movie to be mistaken for a cartoon or as low budget. Studios were charging premium prices for technical perfection and realism. From an executive perspective, using tricks like animating on 2s and 3s instead of frame by frame or hand-drawn smears instead of standard motion blur could be viewed as cheating. It was a risk they simply weren't willing to take, especially when what they were doing was working just fine. So how did this risk finally happen? Like I said, it's not a new concept to try and combine 2D and 3D. While all those techniques, the choppy animation, the smears, and the aesthetic existed before, they had never been combined and executed all at once in a single film, especially with a blockbuster IP. This is why Spider-Verse feels like something new entirely. It wasn't one rule it broke, but several. The animators at Sony were given the creative freedom, stop chasing realism and do this, knowing that the combined effect would be more powerful than chasing realism. And that risk paid off. While Into the Spider-Verse didn't make a staggering amount of money, its critical success was massive. More importantly, it showed Hollywood what was possible, and it became more obvious when Across the Spider-Verse made over twice its predecessor at the box office, proving without a doubt that people actually want to see this. And that success has led to an explosion of creativity. Suddenly, every major studio realized that they could customize, they could do this as well, and they jumped right on the bandwagon. But they aren't just copying, they're taking that Spider-Verse essence, the choppy motion, the hybrid 2D and 3D, and making it their own. The first big statement after Spider-Verse was The Michelle's vs. the Machines, produced and worked on by the same team as Spider-Verse. They wanted the film to look like a beautiful hand-drawn illustration, not a comic book, which is essentially where they differed. They used the choppy frame rate and they mixed the 2D effects onto the 3D background. The entire movie contrasts this warm, messy human world with the clean, hyper-realistic look of the robots. Next, we have Arcane. The core idea it shares with Spider-Verse is that both blend 2D elements onto 3D. They still use hand-drawn effects for things like smoke, fire, and explosions, just like in Spider-Verse, to make the action look raw. But Arcane did not use the graphic comic book art style, and the animation is much more fluid. It's animated on ones most of the time. The visual goal here was to make it look like a beautiful classical painting, so they covered their 3D models and backgrounds in hand-painted textures that look like concept art, which is why you can sort of see brush strokes on the faces of the characters. And what makes it so unique is how they use the style to tell a story. When a character like Jinx starts losing her mind, they overlaid chaotic, messy lines right on her face and on the screen. So Arcane is not just a copy. DreamWorks followed up with Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. The guiding vision here was simple. This is a fairy tale and it should look like a moving storybook illustration. They used the stylized techniques of Spider-Verse. The hair looks scribbled with pencil. The animation has a visual switch built into the frame rate. For calm dialogue and normal movement, the animation is smooth, but the instant an action sequence starts, the motion flips to choppy 2s and 3s with smear frames. It has the primary Spider-Verse techniques, but chooses when and how to use them. And we also have TMNT Mutant Mayhem. This film dialed it up to 100 because the entire movie looks like an artist's first messy concept sketch. They push the scribble line work everywhere, like everywhere. Everywhere was rendered with scribbled lines instead of smooth simulation. The entire 3D world is messy and asymmetrical. Human characters are modeled with extreme asymmetry and a weird ugliness that, if you ask me, separates itself from Spider-Verse with how abstract and expressive it is. The great thing is that these new projects aren't just copying, they're using the techniques like choppy frame rate and 2D elements selectively for narrative importance, not just running it through the entire movie. They're learning to choose a style that best serves the story. The greatest impact of Spider-Verse is that it proved the most important rule is creative choice. It's giving animators the freedom to use whatever style they believe tells the story best, whether drawn, painted, choppy, or smooth. The Spider-Verse style isn't just a look, it's kind of like a declaration of independence for animation. The only rule left is what serves the story best, and that means the future of animation is going to be wildly different and far more interesting.